Taiwan is well regarded as one of the world's most successful economies. But just like any other economy out there, it wasn't built overnight. It was built in years and in decades' time. But the economy of Taiwan has grown tremendously fast when one compares it to the usual economic growth rate seen in Western economies. For instance, if we were to graph out the economic output per capita, also known as GDP per capita of Taiwan, and compare it to major Western economies like the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom, we get to see that Taiwan's economy was very far from these nations. As you can see in the graph right here, in 1950, Taiwan's GDP per capita, according to the Madison Project database, was $1,460. That figure puts the economy of Taiwan on par with Southeast Asian and even a select African economies. And as you can see, the GDP per capita of many Western economies like Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom are so much more than Taiwan. The United States, which leads the dataset, has over $15,240. That's 10 times the GDP per capita of Taiwan. But if we were to adjust this data and check the latest year available for 2022, we get to see that Taiwan's GDP per capita has not only caught up, but it actually surpassed many Western economies' GDP per capita. In 2022, Taiwan's GDP per capita stood at over $53,143, which surpassed nearly every single European economy, and has a GDP per capita that nearly rivals that of the United States. This difference is staggering, and a lot of people have many opinions as to how this had happened. The economic miracle that Taiwan had faced was argued by some to be because of government intervention. The government had played a key role in enabling key industries to flourish, investing heavily in infrastructure, education, and technology. Others, however, argued that this was mainly because of Taiwan's free market economy, which meant that businesses and entrepreneurs had the freedom to innovate, compete, and expand without excessive government control. So, amidst all of these opinions, which one could actually stand as the biggest reason for Taiwan's economy? Well, to understand the economic model that Taiwan had during its economic miracle, let's undergo a historical overview. Taiwan's economy, after the war, which was the Second World War and the Chinese Civil War, the island faced devastated infrastructure, skyrocketing prices, and incoming refugees. The Kuomintang government, which was defeated in the Chinese Civil War, retreated to Taiwan in 1949. There they imposed strict economic controls that led to hyperinflation. Here's a graph on the price levels of Taiwan to show you the severity of the economic crisis at the time. Here, as you can see, Taiwan's economy was indeed in turmoil. In just a few years, the price levels had skyrocketed. Thus, it was imperative that the government needed to do something to stabilize everything. What they had back then, however, wasn't much about their own policies or businesses, but rather US aid. US aid was significant throughout Taiwan's history, but in the first few years of the 1950s, US aid had helped the country stay afloat. For instance, here's a graph on Taiwan's fiscal performance and US aid from 1950 to 1953. Here, you can see that US aid was as big or even more than the government expenditure of Taiwan in these years. And what's surprising about this is the fact that expenditures were already a substantial force in the country's economy. You can see that in the expenditures to GDP, which shows that, for most years, it was more than 20%. But while US aid has helped Taiwan's economy, there was an equally important aspect that was done to push Taiwan to where it is today, and that is land reforms. Land reforms were initiated by the government and not by the market itself. In the Land to the Tiller program from 1951 to 1953, the KMT regime broke up large estates and sold the land to tenant farmers on easy terms. The results were dramatic. The share of farmland owned by those who tilled it rocketed from just 57% to 90% within 2 years, according to Taiwan's Ministry of Interior Statistics. What that simply meant is that farmers who had previously worked on rented land now owned the very fields they cultivated. This shift boosted agricultural productivity, improved rural incomes, and created a new class of small landowners who had a vested interest in maximizing their output. To show you the impact of this government intervention, we can take a look at rice yields. Unfortunately, the data from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization only shows starting in 1961. But here, you can already see that Taiwan's rice yields in tons per hectare had surpassed nearly every single Asian economy. This was a result of this government intervention that broke up large estates owned by landlords and redistributed them to tenant farmers. These were the start of Taiwan's economic growth rate, which indeed saw strong government intervention. But after this, a market-oriented shift was on the horizon. Deregulations were initiated in the late 1950s, which basically meant that the government began to loosen its control over certain industries and allowed private enterprises to flourish. This was the opposite of the start of Taiwan's economy. To show you how this played out, we can graph out the percentage of state enterprise production to total manufacturing production. Here, you can see that the data has shown a rapid decline after the post-war. What that means is that the role of state-owned enterprises in Taiwan's economy diminished over time, while private sector manufacturing grew significantly. This shift signaled Taiwan's transition from a government-led economy to a more market-oriented, private sector-driven model. During these economic growth from the 1960s to 1970s, Taiwan had seen a rise in private businesses. But at the same time, the government had still played a crucial role. They implemented policies that deliberately nurtured outward expansion and had an eye for using market incentives. The state itself had established export processing zones, special areas with tax breaks and infrastructure, to attract investors. The first, opened at Kaohsiung in 1966, was among the earliest of its kind globally. On top of that, the Taiwanese authorities had also kept the currency undervalued and interest rates low to make Taiwanese exports competitive and credit accessible. They offered tax rebates, duty-free imports on inputs, and subsidized loans to firms that succeeded in selling overseas. What this all shows is nothing but government intervention. The government was basically intervening to strategically guide the economy toward export-led growth, while allowing private enterprises to thrive. To depict this, let's take a look at the historical exchange rate of New Taiwan dollar as compared to the US dollar. Here in the graph, you can see that the New Taiwan dollar had stayed the same in value, or depreciated, as compared to the US dollar. This is the exact opposite of the pound, which saw its value appreciating compared to the US dollar. What this basically shows is that Taiwan's currency has continued to be undervalued, which helps it maintain its export competitiveness. And that is the exact opposite of what is seen in the United Kingdom, which saw its currency strengthen naturally as its economy grew. The reason why this is so important is because currency devaluation and pushing companies to export just shows how much the government was intervening into the economy of Taiwan. Simply put, it wasn't really the free market that drove Taiwan's economic success alone. It was a combination of state-led industrial policies and market-oriented incentives. That is why, if we were to graph out the trade balance of Taiwan and the United States, we get to see that the US had continuously been importing more goods than they exported into Taiwan. This is a reflection of the success of Taiwan's export-driven industrial policy. Finally, a key important government intervention policy is tariffs. Tariffs, as some of you may know, have emerged to become a key concept as of late due to Donald Trump. But back in the 1960s, Taiwan actually had significant tariffs. Here's a graph on the nominal tariff rates of Taiwan from 1955 to 1979. Over time, the tariff rates had declined, but at this rate of around 35 to 40%. It was big. It meant that when Taiwan imported something from overseas, like the United States or Japan, those imported goods were significantly more expensive due to tariffs. but the government of Taiwan had avoided a closed market trap by rewarding exporters. Firms that would import raw materials and equipment would actually get duty-free if these were used for export production, which effectively offsetted protectionism. Thus, it was thanks to these measures that one can see that the export of Taiwan had exploded in growth, all thanks to nothing but government intervention. The economic growth rate seen in Taiwan, therefore, in these years was extraordinary. And that is done by no other than the strategic and deliberate policies of the Taiwanese government. By the 1970s, Taiwan's economy was then crowned, along with South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, to be nicknamed as one of the 4 Asian tigers, economies that roared ahead with export-driven growth. This showcased how state-led policies had helped push Taiwan's economy, and not free market principles. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.